This is the Ontario Parliament Television Network.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this, our final session for presenters on Bill 18. This is the Standing Committee on Social Development. Our first presenter today is Survivors of Medical Abuse, Sharon Danley. Ms. Danley, welcome to our committee. We're very pleased to have you here. You have 20 minutes for your presentation. You can use all of that time or part of that time, and if there's any time remaining, the members of the committee will ask you some questions.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for the opportunity to speak to this assemblage on Bill 18, an act to protect children involved in prostitution, and what some of us feel will greatly affect our community and, more importantly, our young women. We appreciate that we are all concerned for the safety and hopefully healthy growth of our young people, but we strongly feel that this bill has too many loopholes, and further, that it sets up the potential to abuse under the guise of concerned authority. Further, we don't see any safeguards built in for accountability and/or deterrence for potential abusers within the authority arena. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you will concur that abuse in systems and institutions is a very real problem in this country. Most have heard of the variety of abuses experienced by the brave and courageous souls disclosing their personal humiliation in public in order to stop these vile acts against others, mostly the vulnerable. The most recent one being that solid institute of Canadian pride, the Maple Leaf Gardens. I am the co-facilitator of Survivors of Medical Abuse. As a counselor, therapist, and a self-esteem trainer, I bring a varied background of study to our group's position on this bill today. Firstly, maybe we missed something, but we find that the title of this bill is misleading, in that police can decide that prostitution may be or is taking place even if a child may not be engaged in such acts. We appreciate that there are those concerned with our young women, children prostituting themselves. But attempting to solve the problem with this bill is a gross misconception of the deeper, real problems. We know these children, women, femmes engage in prostitution for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is poverty. We give a loud, clear message to women when society pays the lowest wage for the most important work, childcare. Why would a woman do this kind of work when she can be paid substantially more? In some cases, up to $10,000 a week for doing substantially less in body prostitution. And when a femme has been incested, raped, or molested, because there still aren't the deterrents in place to abolish these kinds of assaults, it makes it even easier for a young person to sell her body because she's dissociated in the relationship with her body. It's worth noting that historically, society thought it was quite proper for young women to marry at age 14. Yet today, we oppose our femmes engaging in paid sexuality on one hand, while we revere and exploit their bodies on the other. Prostitution inside or outside marriage is just that. However, outside marriage, at least in theory, a femme has her own money and her own life. That is, unless men are insidiously taking the money from her in forms of pimping and forced drug dependency, etc. Whatever happens to these people, anyway. We see this bill as simply a political and religious issue disguising itself as care for our youth. Let me ask, why are the victims still being attacked? The most defenseless, least privileged among us. Why are these young women targeted instead of the men who use their services? Attempting to control femme sexuality without acknowledging male involvement deflects male responsibility while further assaulting women. Blaming women for their bodies while not making men accountable is hypocritical, especially when society supports that a woman's worth is directly linked to her sexual appeal. If we had a proper society, much like the Scandinavian countries, women would not only be safe, they would be respected and equal. Put strong deterrents in place for the users of the trade. Don't further victimize victims, especially with a bill that has potential for further abuse. Arresting and labeling won't do anything except tag and penalize these poor young femmes for life. Historically, arrests encourage higher risk behavior because, among other things, police and courts don't protect in most cases, they punish. More importantly, how will it be determined that a young femme is engaged in prostitution anyway? Police will decide based on perception? Ladies and gentlemen, surely you realize perception is highly subjective. My daughter, who is 25 and can pass for 15, is epileptic and on massive drugs. She could be mistaken for a teenager, on drugs and labeled by who knows what kind of justification as a prostitute. Why not arrest the men involved in any kind of solicitation, not the women? After all, it's the man who can afford to pay for the services. The femme usually needs the money or she wouldn't be soliciting in the first place. Arresting for suspicious behavior rather than action is extremely dangerous and can lead to horrendous injustices, errors, overuse of the courts, and, more importantly, the misuse of power. Where are the provisions built in and guaranteed that the police or workers are ethical, compassionate, skilled, or educated enough to deal with this kind of brutality, beating up on thin victims while leaving their perpetrators alone? The real criminals rarely get dealt with, let alone punished. How can the police make judgments and be supportive at the same time? The recently publicized Jane Doe case certainly speaks volumes about the lack on the part of police departments. And it has been documented that it's not beyond some police to take advantage of prostitutes. Let me clarify here that this is not an attack of police in general, but we cannot ignore the offenders amongst them. Further, what are the criteria for designated safe houses, and who will be the people running them? We've heard countless testimonials, and it's on public record that no institution is unfettered from abusing those it is in place to serve. The children's aid and the social services industry, to name but two, are top of the list of governmental agencies documented who have committed horrendous, irresponsible acts in the name of service. Where is the accountability there? And further still, what if I were trying to protect my daughter from an unethical arrest due to suspicion? Under the bill, I could be fined and imprisoned. Meanwhile, where are the men in all of this? The labeling and criminalizing of what may appear as, yet may not be, prostitution is deflecting the real issue of child poverty and all of its ugliness. Poverty, not prostitution, is the real crime. As an instructor in the fashion industry and trainer of self-esteem, I have personally witnessed countless young women trying to gain self-worth by being the perfect body or face. Most of these young women dream of becoming a fashion model, all in the need to be loved, which of course increases self-esteem. This is yet again society's imposition that women's worth is directly linked to their sexual appeal. Unfortunately, not all young women have solid mentors or family who properly guide and educate them around these issues. And why would so many women feel inadequate? Again, because society tells them through advertising, internet, films, magazines, TV, billboards, commercials, etc., that their worth is directly attributable to their sexual appeal. How can self-esteem prevail with our girls when they are inundated with the idea that pornography, soft porn, erotica, and even fashion television underscores and reveres sex appeal as a woman's most important asset? Society's and the fashion industry's more recent obsession with the waif and heroine look of 12-year-olds is appalling. It's insidiously disguising itself as fashion, where bare-breasted and buttocked young things parade their bodies down the catwalks of Paris, New York, and Japan with scantily covered so-called fashion wear. And this fashion wear is accepted and even revered by the world. It is no wonder that fashion television is legitimized and is the #1 show where men are incarcerated and fed this kind of acceptable visual pornography. Pornography and the acceptance of it is the real crime. Sex highs are an addiction whose appetite increases for younger victims and more sadistic rituals in order to satisfy the media-produced unquenchable thirst for more and increasing sexual deviance. The influence of new and increasing cultures who devalue the women is also growing like a cancer. Some countries, for instance, are known for their lust of the, quote, little girl or child woman look. There are shops in some countries that sell little schoolgirls' used undergarments to a perverted male clientele. This is a sickness, and it is seeing its way to North America, and our girls will be the victims. Vancouver has child prostitution growing in leaps and bounds, and they also have a large influx of these offending cultural contempts for women. Clitorectomies, female ownership, rape, incest, various forms of beatings, and other assaults are growing in this country, ladies and gentlemen, once again because deterrents aren't in place. If the culture is more important than the human rights of the femmes within the culture, then the culture should disappear and allow for a more humane way of living and honoring personkind. Poverty and lack of education are also what should be addressed. Why aren't the funds being poured into these arenas? Our daughters, nieces, granddaughters, and neighbors' lives are at stake. As adults, we are responsible to our youth to give them what they need to grow to their fullest potential, not to penalize them for being victims of our greed, sexual deviance, or indifference to their well-being. We hear that concerned parents of prostitutes have no power. What is it that sends these children to the street and then to drugs only to medicate the pain of the street? How is it that young boys aren't targeted and massively rehabilitated when they are found enticing these young women into prostitution? This government has a responsibility to deal with the deeper crime of poverty, not attack forced vulnerables and dependents for trying to survive. We beg you to stop Bill 18 for the sake of our femmes. Put the money into affordable homes, fairly paid jobs, and education. Put effective deterrents in place for sex trade users and the media that create and feed their sexual hunger. Make men accountable for their acts of lust and perversion, not women for trying to survive their forced poverty. Doing anything less is not only criminal, it's shameful. Once again, I thank you for the opportunity to speak and welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. We have about 2.5 minutes per party. We begin with the NDP, Ms. Boyd.
Thank you very much for coming, Ms. Danley, and I know how concerned you are about coercion when it comes to people who are vulnerable. I think I know you've been at some of the hearings, and you know that it poses a real conundrum for a lot of us who feel as strongly as you do about protecting the victims of those who would exploit them and who certainly define prostitution as child abuse, not self-abuse, child abuse. And so you know that it's a problem to try and figure out how to make them safe. And I would agree with you that the root cause is certainly the whole issue of people being in a position where this is the only way they can make a living. So I don't disagree with you there. On the other hand, we certainly have heard of the difficulty of simply trying to do that, because it very often involves coercion of another kind.
Yes.
For example, in the social assistance system, there is coercion of another kind.
Yes, exactly.
So I hope that I hope that you understand that it's not a simple thing for any of us around this table
I
to
do
try
appreciate
and
it.
figure
I
out
really
how to do this. I take it that you understand that the purpose behind the bill and
Yes.
the discussions we've been having is to protect children.
Yes, I do appreciate that.
Okay. And do you believe that there is no way the bill can be fixed?
Oh, I think there's lots of ways it can be fixed.
Could you suggest that?
First of all, as I see, there's a lot of loopholes. Like, what are safe houses can be decided by the minister. Well, what is a safe house? Who's going to work in them? What is the criteria for the people working in these houses? This is my real concern, is the possible or potential for abuse of workers on vulnerable people. And they need to have a sensitivity, and an experiential education is vital, I believe, far more than theoretical training. Safety, if you're going to incarcerate or pull them away from harming themselves, boy, you better be really good at making it better for them someplace else, because you're going to only add to the hurt, the resentment, the betrayal, and everything else they feel, and in time they'll be back out on the street again. It has to be rehabilitation that works, not that works on paper.
Mr. Brown for the government.
Good afternoon. You know, you and I agree on a big item, and that's the deterrence factor. Because these are kids, and they come to the big city, and the parents don't know where they are, and the authorities can't tell the parents where they are, and it's a big problem. Cause a lot of heartache to the parents. But they come to the big city, and some adult gets a hold of them and befriends them, maybe gives them drugs, and away we go. They're in the business. Yeah. And I've been promoting seizing John's cars, and seizing the assets of the pimps, who oftentimes are drug dealers as well, and realizing those assets into money and plowing it back into some programs to help the kids. I don't know what else. I mean, it's a great attempt that Mr. Bartolucci has done, but it's not going after deterrence. Other than can you give me your opinion on seizing John's cars and attacking them, taking them assets, and what else can we do?
I think that we have to look at the judicial system, unfortunately, because it just doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. It takes up time, takes up money, and in the end, people die off before there's any justice, it feels like. We have to set the deterrence in law. I don't feel really comfortable at an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I think that we've got to have just stronger jail sentences, or better than jail sentences, community work that is, and public discussion. People who are caught doing this, make it public. Let the public know that who these people are, for one thing.
And what about taking their assets to take away the profit motive of the business?
Well,
because they're doing it for money.
Of course they are, and they're going to find another way to get around it. I think that what we have to look at, and it might be a start, but I think that we have to look in the rehabilitation, long and arduous as that will probably be.
To rehabilitate the Johns and the pimps?
Exactly. I know, but when we've got people out there abusing in the sexual arena in a variety of different ways, what is causing them to do this? We have to look at it.
Thank you. Mr. Bartolucci for the Liberals.
Great. Thanks very much for your presentation, Ms. Danley, and I respect your opinion in your presentation. I have a few concerns and maybe a couple of questions about your presentation, and maybe you can expand on them. I don't know how this bill can ever be deemed to be sexist, because I'm certainly concerned about addressing the problem both with the female and the male side of child prostitution. So I guess I don't know exactly where you're coming from in not reading through the legislation, but let's talk and let's follow up on a point that Ms. Boyd made, because it is a relevant point, I believe. I believe presenters should come here offering alternatives and suggestions. And because you mentioned the safe house, maybe we could follow up on that. And I'd ask, because I think it's an integral part of this bill, and I'd like your opinion and your definition of a safe house, because I see where it could form an important part of it.
Okay.
How do you define, how would you, if you were the author of the legislation, define a safe house, and who would be the people that you would put in the safe house in order to achieve the goals and the intent of the bill that I think everybody in Ontario wants?
I think that having been a recipient of the shelter system myself firsthand, I can tell you that what I find appalling in so much of the institutionalization is bureaucratic, administrative overload. Most of the time, the money, the resources are spent in administration. I would make sure that all of the people involved were experientially educated. That is, having been there, done that. I do not agree with bureaucracy or theory or academia running something that's that important. I think we really have to look at the community of survivors. Give them work, because they really can help. And I think it should be absolutely, totally accountable, not only to the government, but to the public, open completely.
Thank you very much, Ms. Danley. We appreciate your very strong presentation and the views you've expressed here today.
Okay, thank you.
Our next presenter is the Streetlight Support Services, Jeff Ramdawar and Amanda Chodora. Are they in the room? Good afternoon. Thanks very much for being here. We